I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there in the middle of that restaurant while my daughter-in-law told a room full of strangers that I was an embarrassment to her career, and I thought, she has no idea who she's talking to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Eugene. I'm 63 years old, and for most of my adult life, I worked with my hands. Roofing, mostly. Started when I was 19, swinging a nail gun in July heat that would make your lungs feel like wet cardboard. By the time I was 35, I had my own crew. By 45, I had 3 crews and a small contracting company that did commercial flat roofing across the mid-Atlantic. Nothing glamorous. But it was mine, and I built it from nothing, and I was proud of it. Then the 2008 crash hit. Commercial construction dried up overnight. I held on longer than most, but by 2011, I had let go of everything. The crews, the equipment, the office, the yard where I kept my trucks. My wife had passed 2 years before that from cancer, and without her steadiness, I think I just stopped fighting as hard as I should have. I don't say that to make excuses. I say it because it's true, and this story doesn't make sense without it. By 2013, I was staying in a men's shelter on the east side of Baltimore. I had a locker, a cot, and a phone with a cracked screen. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, even if he forgot it for a while, was 27 at the time and doing well for himself. Software sales. He lived in a nice apartment in D.C. with his girlfriend, who would later become his wife, who would later become the woman I'm telling you about. He knew where I was. I want to be clear about that. He knew, and he sent money when he could. Not much, and not often, but he knew. He didn't come see me. There's a difference between knowing and doing something about it, and for a long time, my son only did the first part. I understood it, even if it hurt. He was ashamed. Not of himself. Of me. I could tell from the way he talked on the phone. Always a little rushed. Always with one ear listening for someone coming into the room. I was the thing he hadn't figured out how to explain to the life he was building. His girlfriend's name was Renata. She was sharp, ambitious, and came from money. Her father ran a regional logistics company out of Northern Virginia, the kind of operation that moves freight contracts worth 8 figures a year. She wasn't cruel in an obvious way, not at first. She was the kind of person who made you feel small through implication. A long pause before answering. A slight smile when you said something she found provincial. That sort of thing. When my son called to tell me he was getting married, I was genuinely happy for him. When he told me about the wedding, a venue in Loudoun County, wine country, about 200 guests, I started to ask questions. He got quiet in a way I recognized. Dad, look, Renata's family is going to have a lot of important people there. I need you to understand that it might be better if I what? Another pause. If you just kind of stayed in the background, okay? I'm not saying don't come. I want you there. But Renata's family, her dad's business contacts, this is a big night for us. I told him I'd behave myself. I said it without sarcasm, which cost me more than he'll ever know. I borrowed a suit from a guy at the shelter who was close to my size. He was a good man, former Navy, and he pressed it himself with an iron he shared from the front closet. It was a little big in the shoulders. I took a bus to the venue. The wedding itself was beautiful, I'll give her that. Lights in the oak trees, a string quartet for the ceremony, tablecloths that probably cost more than my first truck. I sat near the back during the ceremony, like I'd been asked to. I smiled when my son looked nervous walking to the altar. I caught his eye once and nodded, and he nodded back, and for a moment it felt like we were okay. The reception was where things fell apart. I was at a table near the edge of the tent with some cousins of Renata's I hadn't met, people who were perfectly polite and didn't know quite what to make of me. I was fine with that. I had a glass of water and I watched my son dance with his new wife, and I told myself this was enough. Being there was enough. Then Renata's father came over. His name was Clifton. Big man. Silver hair. The kind of easy confidence that comes from decades of people doing what you say. He sat down across from me without being invited, which I respected. He looked at me the way a man looks at another man when he's trying to figure out exactly who he's dealing with. "You're the father," he said. "I am." "What do you do?" I told him the truth. I'd been in roofing for 20 years, had a company that didn't survive the recession, was currently trying to get back on my feet. I didn't dress it up. I didn't minimize it either. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My first business went under in '91. Trucking company. Lost everything. Took me 6 years to rebuild." He picked up his water glass. "Man who's built something and lost it knows things. A man who never lost anything can't learn in school." He held up his glass like a small toast. I held up mine. "I appreciate that," I said. He nodded and went back to his table. That was the moment. That was the moment that mattered, though I didn't fully understand it yet. About an hour later, Renata found me. I was standing near the edge of the tent getting some air, talking to nobody. She came over with 2 of her bridesmaids trailing behind her like they'd been summoned, and she had that smile, the one that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. "I think it's time for some of the older guests to start heading out," she said, not to me specifically at first. Then she looked at me. "Especially you." I thought I'd misheard her. "Sorry. You're making some of my father's colleagues uncomfortable." She said it quietly, but not so quietly that her bridesmaids couldn't hear. She gestured at me vaguely, in a way that meant all of me, everything I was. "I don't know what my husband told you about tonight, but this is an important event. I need you to leave." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the suit, about the guy who'd ironed it for me. I thought about the bus ride and the back table, and staying in the background like I'd promised. I said, "Congratulations on your wedding," and I walked out. I didn't look for my son on the way out. I found out later he'd seen me leaving and didn't come after me. I don't know what he told himself about that. I stopped trying to answer questions I wasn't asked. What Renata didn't know, what my son had apparently never told her, was that a few months before the wedding I had started working again. Not roofing, something different. While I was at the shelter, I had a lot of time to think, and I started helping a younger guy named Marcus with a startup he was trying to get off the ground. He was maybe 30, former electrician, and he had an idea for prefabricated commercial roofing panels that could cut installation time by about 40%. He had the idea and the technical chops. What he didn't have was someone who'd spent 20 years buying materials, negotiating subcontracts, understanding what commercial property managers actually wanted and why. I had that. And it turned out it was worth more than I'd given myself credit for. I came in as an advisor at first, unofficially, just to have something to do. Within a few months, he asked me to come on as COO. We filed the paperwork in February of the year. My son got married. By the time of the wedding, we had 2 pilot contracts with commercial developers in Virginia and 1 in Maryland. By the following spring, we had a dozen. I didn't tell my son any of this. Not because I was hiding it. I tried to call a few times, but the conversations were short and careful, and he never really asked what I was doing. I think he decided a version of me that was easier to live with, and he didn't want new information disturbing that. The company was called Summit Panel Systems. We bootstrapped for the first 18 months, then took a Series A from a firm out of Reston. $12 million. I remember sitting in the conference room after the term sheet was signed and thinking about the iron suit. We were small by industry standards, but in the commercial construction world we were starting to make noise. Our panels were cheaper to install, held up better in high wind zones, and we had proprietary fire rating certifications that nobody else had at our price point. That last part was because I'd spent nearly a year working with a testing lab in Pennsylvania to develop the certification protocol. That documentation, the methodology, the testing procedures, the materials specs, was protected. I'd made sure of that before we started talking to investors. I moved out of the shelter in the spring after the wedding. Got a one-bedroom in Catonsville. Nothing fancy. But I had a lease in my name and a key on my keychain, and I slept better than I had in years. My son called about a year after the wedding. The conversation was short and stilted. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He said Renata sent her regards. I said okay. 2 years after that call, I got a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letter informed me that a company called Meridian Commercial Solutions had filed for declaratory judgment, claiming that certain fire rating certification methodologies Summit panel systems had been using commercially were derived from proprietary documentation that Meridian alleged it held rights to. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called our attorney. Meridian Commercial Solutions. I'd never heard of them. But when our attorney started digging, the picture became very clear, very fast. Meridian was a subsidiary formed 18 months prior. Its parent company was a logistics and commercial real estate firm based in Northern Virginia, Renata's father's company, not Clifton himself. When I understood the full structure, I actually believed that Clifton ran the parent company and he was smart enough not to dirty his own hands with this. This was Renata's doing, and probably one of her father's lieutenants, someone who saw our fire rating documentation in a pitch we'd done to one of Clifton's commercial property contacts and thought they could reverse engineer it and get there first. They were wrong about the timeline, and they were catastrophically wrong about the documentation. I had dated, signed, notarized engineering logs going back to the first week we started developing the certification protocol. I had emails, lab reports, correspondence with the testing facility in Pennsylvania, everything. Our IP attorney, and I had a good one, because we'd done this right from the beginning, took one look at Meridian's filing and told me we didn't just have a defense. We had a counterclaim. They're trying to steal something you built, she said, and they left fingerprints everywhere. We filed the counterclaim within 90 days. I want to be honest about something. Part of me didn't want to fight. There was a version of this where I called Clifton directly, asked if we could work something out, kept it civil. I sat with that version for about a week, but then I thought about the tent, the bridesmaids, especially you. The way my son stood somewhere inside that reception and watched me walk out and did nothing. I thought about the guy who ironed the suit. I filed. The counterclaim went to mediation first. Meridian's lawyers were confident in a way that made me think they were used to dealing with people who couldn't afford to fight back. We were past that. Summit panel had grown considerably in 2 years. We were in 11 states. We'd closed a second funding round. We had real infrastructure and real legal muscle. Mediation failed because Meridian wouldn't move on their position. They genuinely seemed to believe they could win. Our attorney thought that was because nobody had walked them through the actual evidence yet. The deposition process changed, lad. I won't go through all of it, but there were 2 documents that ended Meridian's case. The first was a chain of emails recovered from the pitch materials we'd sent to one of Clifton's property contacts that showed exactly when Meridian began developing their competing certification protocol. 2 weeks after that pitch. The second was a set of notarized engineering logs from our lab in Pennsylvania, showing our methodology had been developed and filed internally, 17 months before Meridian was even incorporated as a company. Meridian existed to steal one specific thing, and the one specific thing they tried to steal was documented in more detail than they had apparently imagined possible. Their attorneys asked to settle 8 weeks before trial. We settled for $4.3 million in damages, a permanent injunction against Meridian's fire rating product line, and the licensing agreement that would pay Summit Panel a royalty on any commercial use of the underlying methodology for the next 12 years. I didn't call anyone to celebrate. I drove home, heated up some soup, and watched a baseball game. Cleveland was playing. I don't even follow Cleveland. It didn't matter. I just needed to sit somewhere quiet and let it land. I found out about my son's divorce through a mutual acquaintance, a cousin of mine who'd seen something on social media. He and Renata separated about 14 months after the lawsuit settled. I don't know the details. I didn't ask. He called me on a Tuesday morning in November. I was at the office. He said he wanted to see me. I said I was busy. He said he knew, that he'd been following the company, that he'd read about the lawsuit settlement. I didn't say anything. Dad. His voice was different, older. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. No, I said. You don't. Silence. I still want to see you, he said. I told him I'd think about it. I meant it honestly. I wasn't sure what I wanted. There's a version of fatherhood I've heard people talk about where love is unconditional in a way that means you take it no matter what shape it comes back to you in. Maybe that's true for some people. For me, love was unconditional. But showing up for somebody is different. Showing up has to be earned on both ends. We met at a diner in Towson 3 weeks later. He looked like himself, but quieter. Like some of the noise had been taken out of him. He ordered coffee and looked at his hands. He said he was sorry. He said it wasn't adequate, and he knew it. He said he didn't know how to explain what he'd allowed to happen, except to say he'd been afraid, and being afraid had made him into something he wasn't proud of, and he'd spent the better part of 3 years understanding that. I listened. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't, not entirely. I didn't tell him I was over it, because I wasn't. But I told him he was my son, and I told him I wasn't going anywhere, and I told him that we'd see. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked out the window. You really built something, Dad, he said. I thought about what Clifton had said to me at that reception. Man who's built something and lost it knows things. A man who never lost anything can't learn in school. I built it twice, I said. He laughed, a little shakily. And then I did too. That diner was about 8 months ago. My son and I talk most weeks now. Sometimes it's just 10 minutes, sometimes longer. We don't talk about Renata, and we don't talk about the wedding, and we don't talk about the shelter. Not yet. Maybe someday. Right now we talk about work and baseball, and what he should do about the brakes on his car, and what it's like to get old, and whether his company's 401k plan is worth contributing to above the match. Normal things. We're building something, I suppose. Slower this time because we're doing it right. Summit Panel is in 16 states now. We're looking at a 3rd funding round. Marcus bought a house in Ellicott City. I take home a salary that would have seemed like science fiction to the man sleeping on that cot in East Baltimore. I still have the suit. My friend from the shelter gave it to me outright before he moved to his daughter's place in Roanoke. I don't wear it often, but it's hanging in my closet, pressed and clean. And every now and then I see it, and I think about standing at the edge of that tent with a glass of water, watching the lights in the oak trees, knowing something that nobody in that room knew yet, that I was just getting started. I keep coming back to the suit. The borrowed, slightly too big suit that a man I barely knew pressed with a shared iron in a shelter hallway so I could look decent at my son's wedding. That image stays with me more than the lawsuit, more than the settlement check, more than any of it. Here's what I've come to understand. The way things turned out wasn't luck. It wasn't fate working some invisible scoreboard. It was cause and effect, playing out the way it always does, slowly, without announcements, on its own schedule. Renata built her life on the assumption that appearances were everything, that a man in a borrowed suit at a back table was a man without value, that humiliating someone quietly in front of just enough witnesses carried no real cost. She was wrong on all of it, and the reason she was wrong wasn't some cosmic punishment raining down on her. It was simpler than that. She had stopped paying attention to what was actually real. Her father, Clifton, I'll give him this. He paid attention. He sat down uninvited, looked me in the eye, and listened. He didn't see the suit. He saw a man who had built something, lost it, and was still sitting upright. That recognition came from character, the kind you can't inherit and can't buy. It's the thing that tells you what a person is actually made of before the resume says anything at all. Marcus had it too. A 30-year-old with an idea and no capital, who took a chance on a man he'd met in a shelter because he could see past the surface of a situation. That kind of judgment, knowing who to trust, knowing what matters, is worth more than any term sheet. I think about the years I spent in that shelter, and I want to be honest, I could have stopped. I could have decided that what happened to my company was the final word on my story. A lot of people do. And I don't judge them, because I know how heavy that weight gets. But I didn't stop. And I want to say clearly that it wasn't because I'm exceptional. It was because I couldn't convince myself that what I knew, 20 years of it, hard-won and specific, had simply expired. That knowledge was still there. It just needed somewhere to go. What I learned from all of this isn't a tidy lesson I could write on a card. It's more like a reckoning. The way you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you, or to you, is a complete portrait of who you are. Renata showed me exactly who she was at that reception, and she showed Clifton too, and she showed my son, though it took him longer to see it clearly. My son is trying. That matters to me. Not because it undoes what happened, but because trying is where character actually lives. Not in the absence of failure, but in what you do with it afterward. I built something twice. The first time I had more energy and less sense. The second time I had less energy and enough sense to do it right. I'll take that trade, and if you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, sitting with a loss that feels permanent, wondering if what you know still counts for anything, I'd just say, it does. It still counts. Keep going.